This morning we're privileged to have with us Mr. Blake Seward from the Smiths Falls District Collegiate Institute, a history teacher. Now, as a history teacher, as a lover of history, as a man who respects the sacrifices made in the two great wars in the Korean conflict, Blake was concerned that the contributions of those who died serving in the First World War have been largely forgotten. He therefore began researching the military history of his own great uncle. And he soon realized that this type of research would be an exciting way to make history come alive in the classroom. Now, his commitment to teaching Canadian history has been recognized by a number of awards, including the Veterans Affairs Commendation, the Prime Minister's Award for Teaching Excellence. In 2006, he was awarded the Governor General's Award for Excellence in Teaching Canadian History. Now, last year, November 25th, 2016, Blake was awarded the Meritorious Service Medal for Outstanding Service to Canada by the Governor General at Rideau Hall. And he was granted that for his involvement with the Lest We Forget project, a project which started 15 years ago with the help of his grade 10 class to digitize Canada's military service files, the country's largest collection of files. Now, the award-winning Lest We Forget project success is highlighted by its replication across the Upper Canada District School Board and the creation of a pan-Canadian project for students inspired by Blake Seward's project that involves the Library and Archives Canada and Veterans Affairs Canada. The Lest We Forget project is now one of the largest digital projects in the world and includes approximately 48 million pages of documents, which have thousands of online viewers per month, including educators, students, and members of the general public. Blake is a fellow of the Gregg Center at the University of New Brunswick and a faculty associate of the Laurier Center at Wilfrid Laurier University. He holds a Master's of Education and has taught for various school boards over 20 years. And it is truly amazing that we were able to have you join us this morning. And Blake will be giving our reflection. Blake, yes, please. Welcome. Thank you.
Oh, boy. It is my pleasure to be here. I apologize for my voice. I am struggling with a little bit of a cold. Good morning, Reverend Chris, any veterans, their wives, members of the congregation, and of course, anybody and everybody that is important that went to UNB. Where's Tom? There he is. Thank you for inviting me to speak briefly today about the soldiers that are on the honor roll here in the church and on our cenotaph down in Victoria Park. But before I begin, I want to express my sincere sadness at the passing of Mr. Douglas Kilpatrick. The Colonel, as we called him, was dedicated to the men and women who fought and served in this country, as did his father, who fought at Passchendaele and was wounded at Passchendaele in 1917 as a member of the Cyclist Corps. You are missed, Mr. Kilpatrick. Mr. Kilpatrick is also a relative of mine and my great uncle, Clarence Garfield Maines, who really kind of started the whole Lest We Forget project, was Doug Kilpatrick's wife's first cousin. And so we actually had that bond as well. Approximately 100 years ago, congregations across Canada took it upon themselves to honor the war dead. Artist and member of the Group of Seven, A.J. Casson, was responsible for the stencil design. And you'll notice if you look at the bottom of your honor rolls, you will actually see A.J. Casson. The collection of names was started after the end of the Great War, and unfortunately this process would be repeated a decade later, shortly after the Second World War. For many of us, we are familiar with Kenneth Spooner, who was one of 9 Canadians to receive the George Cross. We may be familiar with Gerald Dawson, who was killed on the approach to taking the city of Caen, France, as a member of the Stormont, Dundas, and Glengarry Highlanders in July 1944. He is often overlooked because he's not a D-Day casualty. For many, we think of Normandy. When we think of Normandy, we only consider the first day and not the other 81 days that represent the days of the Normandy campaign. Major Charles Slack was killed south of Caen in the heavy tank battles in the late stages of the infamous closing of what we know as the Falaise Gap in August 1944. Major Charles Edward Slack was killed instantly by an enemy mortar round that landed near where he was moving between tanks, encouraging the men during Operation Totalize. Major Slack was a member of the Governor General's Foot Guards, or the Gugafugs, as they were called. And his brother, Lieutenant Colonel William Slack, was killed in Korea in 1956. Norman Dalton Tizick was killed in December 1944 in what is often the forgotten front of the war, Italy. Tizick may well have been told that he was a D-Day dodger, but those that fought there were well aware of how difficult the fighting was in the hills and valleys of Sicily and Italy. John James Saunders, a member of the Royal Canadian Artillery, was killed in a traffic accident and is buried in Surrey, England. And John Raymond Warren survives the war only to be taken by tuberculosis in April 1946. And he is actually buried alongside John Saunders in Brookwood Cemetery in England. And there are many more. This congregation has soldiers that fought in the Great War battles of the Somme, Hill 70, which is another forgotten battle, Vimy, and Passchendaele. We also have the Second Battle of Ypres, where the first gas was used in the history of warfare. William Benson Craig, who is also on our honor roll, was killed in September 1918 when he was last seen, and this is in the war diary, heading his plane into the sunset, never to be seen again, according to the war diary. He receives the Distinguished Flying Cross for the number of enemy aircraft he shot down. On this wall are soldiers killed in the defensive movements of the Hindenburg Line in March of 1918. Lawrence Wark is killed at the DQ, Drocourt-Queant line, in September 1918, when Allied forces were quite certain that the war was going to end in their favor. Spite is killed in October 1918, just outside the city of Cambrai, France. And John Arthur Connell would die of the flu 3 months after the war. But today I thought I would share the story of George William James Hopkins, who lived at 39 Lombard Street here in town. His father was from Smiths Falls, and his mother, Flossie, was from Plum Hollow. Before the war, Hopkins was a printer, having left Frost & Wood's factory because the money was not sufficient for his needs. He was adequate at sports and collected stamps as a hobby. Hopkins joined the Royal Canadian Air Force, and he began his training in what was the BCATP, the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan, which I personally believe is probably one of the top 5 most significant events to shape the Canada that we know. You cannot travel in and out of any airport in Canada and not be walking in the footsteps of airmen of the Second World War. Consider this. In 1940, approximately half the entire federal government budget was committed to the building of the towns and urban centers that were built around these air training bases. And Hopkins was a part of this. He moved from training center to training center before he was shipped over to England to continue his final training as an air gunner. Excuse me. Sorry. I apologize. I thought I would talk about Hopkins because his story is one of mystery. On September 6, 1943, Connell was a part of a 6-hour cross-country training run heading west across southern England and Wales. The crew was flying in a Wellington III out across the Irish Sea. At 8:50 p.m., they took off, making contact every 15 minutes with Coastal Command until last contact at 1:43 a.m. on the 7th of September. And then they vanished. The next day, serial search parties, combed the rough seas, where 2 bodies were spotted floating in the rocky coastline of Wales. And the next day, the body of Sergeant George William James Hopkins was found floating in the water. The rest of the crew were never discovered, and no wreckage was ever spotted. Now, I wanted to spend some time with Hopkins, if you will, because he is not connected to a specific battle or bombing raid. He was not shot down over Berlin or Hamburg on a sortie. He was flying what was considered to be a reliable aircraft. In fact, the Wellington was often called the indestructible aircraft because of how many shells could punch through the skin of the plane and still it would fly. No enemy aircraft were tracked in the area, so it is unlikely that they were shot down, which simply leaves mechanical problems as the suspect cause of the crash. I thought I would give a little time to Sergeant Hopkins today because he was married just before he left for the war. He was loved and loved his wife, Lillian. How much it must have hurt to be married so briefly with all the potential of the world and life in front of them, only to be dashed by a failed training run over the Irish Sea. War can be cruel to rip apart families and loved ones. Another reason I wanted to give some time to Sergeant Hopkins today is that he died when he was only 19. He was married at 18 and enlisted when he was 18. He may have wanted to make sure that in his mortality, he loved a woman and was loved. All of this hits close to home for me because my son is soon to be 18, and he feels the power of youth in his veins, as I suspect did Sergeant George William James Hopkins. Because Hopkins is killed in this way, it is important for all of us to remember those that were not attached to a battle or a bombing run. If anybody here likes music, Genesis, which was a great big band in the 1970s, Peter Gabriel, who was a singer, borrowed a song from David Bowie, and the song is called Heroes. And for us, this is important because there's a line in it. And the line is, this should remind us to each and every one of them that we need to make sure that they are a hero, if just for one day. It is important for us to remember those that might be easy to forget. And this is why, at the going down of the sun, we will remember them, lest we forget.